I knew something was wrong the second I stepped out onto my back porch that morning because my dogs weren't barking. They were just standing there stiff, staring toward the well shed like they'd seen a ghost. And sitting right in the middle of my property, reflecting the sunrise like some kind of trophy, was a brand new steel lockbox bolted over my water pump. Bright silver metal, heavy industrial hinges, fresh drill marks still glittering in the wood, and zip-tied to the handle was a red notice stamped property violation, unauthorized water access. I remember just standing there holding an empty coffee mug, blinking like my brain refused to process what I was looking at. Because this wasn't some abandoned utility line or shared neighborhood hookup. This was my private well. My land. My electricity powering the pump. I'd been drawing water from that same aquifer for almost 16 years. Never missed a permit renewal. Never had a complaint filed against me. Never owed the county a dime. But apparently the folks running the Pine Hollow Estates HOA had decided they were kings now. And kings, apparently, don't like people living outside their little system. See, about 6 months earlier, a new HOA board got elected after a bunch of retirees moved into the subdivision from out of state. Real clipboard people, the kind that smile too hard while threatening you. They started with mailbox colors, then lawn measurements, then community appearance standards. Typical HOA nonsense. But then they got obsessed with utilities. They wanted every home connected to a centralized neighborhood water service they'd been secretly building behind the clubhouse. Problem was, a handful of us on the outer lots already had private wells, fully legal, fully independent, and we weren't interested in paying monthly fees for chlorinated tap water that tasted like somebody rinsed pennies in a swimming pool. I tried staying polite at first. Big mistake. A week before they locked my pump, I'd gotten a letter from the HOA president, a guy named Randall Pierce. Slick hair, fake tan, expensive loafers, always talking like he was campaigning for governor. The letter claimed all residents were now required to transition into the Community Water Initiative for the collective benefit of neighborhood harmony. Yeah, harmony. That word always shows up right before somebody tries to control you. I ignored the letter because legally they had no authority over groundwater access outside the municipal district. At least, that's what I thought. Then came the lockbox. I walked right up to it and rattled the padlock hard enough to shake the whole pipe assembly. Nothing. Solid steel. Somebody had spent real money installing that thing. My first thought wasn't even anger, honestly. It was disbelief. Like, who wakes up one morning and decides to physically seize another man's water source? I called the HOA office immediately and got transferred to Randall after 2 minutes of fake elevator jazz music. And man, I still remember that voice. Calm, slow, smug as hell. Mr. Mercer, he said, we were wondering when you'd notice. Notice? Like they'd trim my hedges or something. I told him he had exactly 1 hour to remove the lock before I called the sheriff. And this guy actually laughed, not loud, not nervous, that soft little country club chuckle rich people do when they think consequences are optional. Then he says, Elias, if you want to remain part of this community, cooperation isn't negotiable anymore. That sentence hit me harder than I expected because suddenly this wasn't about water. It was about submission. They wanted compliance. Public compliance. They couldn't stand the fact that some of US didn't need their system, didn't depend on their approvals, didn't bow every time they invented a new fee. And the crazy part? They really thought they could pressure people into surrendering basic property rights just by acting confident enough. That night somebody slid another notice under my front door. Daily fines begin Monday for unauthorized water usage. I laughed when I first read it. Then I stopped laughing the next morning when I turned on my kitchen faucet and heard absolutely nothing. No pressure, no sputter, no drip, silence. They'd cut the breaker feeding electricity to the well pump. I just stood there staring at the sink while morning light came through the blinds. And for the first time since moving to Pine Hollow, I felt something ugly settle into my chest. Not panic exactly, something colder. Because people like Randall always make one fatal mistake. They get addicted to power before they understand the limits of it. And standing there in that quiet kitchen, listening to dead pipes echo through my walls, I realized something. If these idiots were willing to illegally tamper with private utilities just to force compliance, there was no way their shiny little community water system was actually legit. And once that thought crawled into my head, I couldn't let it go. Now let me pause the story for a second because this right here is where a lot of people get trapped, especially in HOA neighborhoods. Folks assume that because an HOA sends a letter with bold text and legal-sounding language, it automatically means they have actual authority. Most of the time, they're counting on intimidation, not law. According to standard procedure, an HOA can usually enforce rules tied to shared property, appearance standards, dues, stuff like that. But private utility systems are a completely different animal, especially when county permits and state water rights enter the picture. From a legal perspective, physically tampering with somebody's permitted well equipment is the kind of thing that can escalate real fast because now you're crossing from civil enforcement into potential criminal interference. And here's the psychological part most people miss. This is a psychological trap. HOA boards like this often create what I call manufactured consensus. They pressure a few residents publicly, collect compliance from the nervous ones, then use that momentum to isolate the holdouts. Once enough neighbors give in, the target starts feeling crazy for resisting, even when they're legally right. Randall understood that perfectly. He didn't just want my water connected to the system. He wanted visible obedience because power structures like that survive on perception. The lesson here is, when somebody in authority starts talking more about community harmony than actual regulations, you better slow down and start reading paperwork. Because real legal authority rarely needs theatrical intimidation. Fake authority practically survives on it. And the second I realized Pine Hollow's board was operating on confidence instead of legality, I stopped feeling angry. I started getting curious. The next morning, I drove straight down to the county records office about 40 minutes outside town, the kind of old government building that smells like dust, burnt coffee, and 1987. I didn't even fully know what I was looking for yet. I just had this feeling gnawing at me that Randall and his little HOA empire had gotten way too bold way too fast. And people don't usually act that fearless unless they think nobody's checking paperwork. So I started digging. Parcel maps, zoning filings, utility permits, environmental approvals, stacks and stacks of documents spread across this scratched wooden table while an old ceiling fan clicked overhead like something out of a crime movie. Hours passed. My eyes hurt. My back hurt. Then finally, there it was. One missing permit. Then another. Then a pipeline diagram that made my stomach flip sideways. Their so-called community water system wasn't a licensed residential utility at all. It was an illegally modified agricultural feed line originally installed years earlier to supply irrigation water to a commercial tree nursery outside county limits. Those idiots had literally spliced neighborhood homes into a farm supply pipe and started charging residents monthly service fees like they were a legitimate municipal provider. No state certification, no treatment authorization, no water quality compliance testing. Nothing. Just a bunch of arrogant retirees playing government because nobody had challenged them yet. I leaned back in that chair staring at the paperwork thinking, oh, Randall, you have absolutely no idea how bad this is. And honestly, that's when the anger left me completely. Because revenge is emotional, but consequences are patient. I copied every document I could find, highlighted permit numbers, photographed maps, and drove home in complete silence. Didn't call the sheriff. Didn't argue with neighbors. Didn't even respond to the latest HOA violation notice taped to my garage. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table that night with a yellow legal pad and called the State Water Resources Compliance Hotline. The woman who answered sounded exhausted, like she'd spent 20 years listening to people complain about drainage ditches and septic tanks. But the second I explained what Pine Hollow had done, her whole tone changed. Wait, she interrupted. They physically restricted access to your permitted groundwater system? With a steel lockbox, I told her. Silence. Keyboard clicking. Then she asked, in this HOA utility network, are they licensed through the state residential distribution registry? No, ma'am, I said, sliding the permit copies in front of me. They're operating off a converted agricultural line. Another silence. Longer this time. Finally, she exhaled and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Sir, if what you're describing is accurate, this is significantly illegal. Significantly illegal. Man, those are beautiful words when spoken about your enemies. She told me inspectors would likely investigate within a few weeks. I thanked her, hung up, and went to bed smiling for the first time in days. Meanwhile, Randall kept escalating because guys like that mistake silence for surrender. Every morning, there'd be another violation notice. Unauthorized utility usage. Noncompliance penalties. Potential property lien review. One afternoon, I caught him slowly driving past my house in a golf cart with two board members riding shotgun like suburban mobsters. Randall waved at me with this smug little grin while my yard sprinklers sat dead and silent behind him. He thought he'd won already. That's the thing about power-drunk people. They stop recognizing danger if it arrives quietly. 2 weeks later, around 8:15 on a Tuesday morning, I heard heavy engines outside. I looked through my front window and nearly spilled my coffee laughing. 3 white state utility trucks were rolling into Pine Hollow Estates bumper to bumper like an invasion force. Men in reflective vests climbed out carrying testing kits, binders, cameras, soil probes, the whole circus. And behind them, county inspectors, environmental compliance officers, even a sheriff's deputy parked near the clubhouse entrance. Oh yeah, somebody upstairs had taken this very seriously. The neighborhood went into full panic mode almost immediately. Curtains started twitching. Front doors opened. People walked outside holding coffee cups trying to act casual, while 12 different officials spread across the subdivision collecting water samples from hydrants and utility junctions. Randall came storming out of the clubhouse 15 minutes later, already sweating through his pastel polo shirt. I watched from my porch while he marched toward the lead inspector, waving a folder around like a lunatic. Couldn't hear every word from that distance, but I definitely heard miscommunication and temporary infrastructure solution. The inspector didn't even blink, just kept writing notes while another team traced the underground line network toward the east end of the subdivision. And that's when everything detonated. Because buried behind the Pine Hollow clubhouse, under a decorative flower bed full of cheap mulch and dying roses, inspectors uncovered the main splice junction connecting residential homes to the agricultural irrigation pipe. Illegal valves, unauthorized pressure regulators, residential branch lines installed with hardware store components. It looked less like public infrastructure and more like something built by drunk uncles over a holiday weekend. Residents started gathering in clusters, whispering to each other, while inspectors photographed everything. Then one of the state guys walked over to the sheriff deputy and said something that made the deputy immediately grab his radio. Randall's face turned gray. Not pale gray, like his soul left through his ears. About an hour later, officials began stapling emergency notices onto every front door in the neighborhood. Immediate suspension of unlicensed water distribution system. Residents were told not to drink, cook with, or bathe in the supplied water until contamination testing could be completed. And that's when the mob turned. See, people can tolerate corruption right up until it inconveniences them personally. The second families realized their water supply might be unsafe, all that HOA loyalty evaporated instantly. Neighbors started screaming at board members in driveways. One woman hurled a half-empty water jug at the clubhouse wall hard enough to explode plastic everywhere. Another resident shouted, "You told us this was county approved." Randall kept trying to regain control, barking phrases like procedural misunderstanding and temporary compliance delay, but nobody was buying it anymore. The illusion had cracked. And once fake authority cracks publicly, it collapses fast. Then came my favorite part. One of the inspectors walked directly across my lawn carrying bolt cutters. He nodded toward the steel lockbox sitting over my well pump and asked, "This the equipment they tampered with?" I said, "Sure is." He examined the HOA padlock for maybe 2 seconds before snapping the cutters shut with one clean crunch. Loud, sharp, final. The lock hit the dirt, and for some reason that sound felt incredibly satisfying. Another inspector removed the housing while documenting everything with photos. Fresh scrape marks, unauthorized installation hardware. Evidence tags went on the whole setup like it was a crime scene, which honestly, it kinda was. I flipped the breaker back on myself. The pump kicked alive with that deep mechanical rumble I hadn't realized I missed so much. Then a second later, water burst through the garden hose in one hard, violent stream, crystal clear under the morning sun. And I swear to God, the entire neighborhood turned and looked at me all at once. Not Randall, not the inspectors, me. Because in that moment, everybody understood exactly what had happened. The independent guy they mocked for refusing HOA control had been right the whole time. Randall stared at that flowing water like it personally insulted him. I almost felt bad for him, almost. Over the next month, the fallout got ugly. Real ugly. State regulators hit Pine Hollow estates with massive fines for unauthorized utility distribution, unsafe infrastructure modifications, and environmental compliance violations. The HOA's insurance provider dropped them almost immediately after the investigation findings became public. Residents filed civil claims demanding reimbursement for years of fraudulent utility fees. Several homeowners claimed health issues tied to water quality concerns. The county opened a formal inquiry into financial misconduct after discovering board members had been paying themselves administrative oversight bonuses using utility revenue. Yeah, turns out the water project wasn't about neighborhood harmony after all. Big surprise there. 3 board members resigned within days. Another hired an attorney and stopped answering calls completely. And Randall? Man, Randall vanished overnight. No goodbye email. No final meeting. His office at the clubhouse got cleaned out over one weekend like he'd entered witness protection. Rumor was he moved to Arizona, which honestly feels very on-brand for a guy who tried stealing groundwater from his own neighbors. The HOA eventually paid for full restoration of my well system, electrical repairs, property damages, and legal reimbursement after their attorneys realized dragging things into court would expose even more internal records. Funny how fast bullies become negotiators once evidence enters the room. And these days, every morning when I turn on my kitchen faucet, the water comes out cold, steady, perfectly clean, powered by the same private well they once tried to seize. Sometimes I'll stand there for an extra second just listening to it run, because that sound means something different now. It's not just water anymore. It's proof. Proof that people drunk on power almost always overplay their hand eventually. And proof that sometimes the smartest revenge isn't screaming, threatening, or fighting in public. Sometimes, it's just handing arrogant people enough rope to introduce themselves to the law. Looking back now, I honestly think the wildest part of the whole thing wasn't the illegal pipeline or the lockbox, or even the fines. It was how many intelligent people went along with it simply because somebody sounded confident while giving orders. That's the real danger in neighborhoods like Pine Hollow. Most folks don't want conflict. They've got jobs, kids, mortgages, stress already stacked to the ceiling. So when an HOA board speaks with enough certainty, people start assuming resistance must be pointless. And that's exactly how small abuses grow into massive ones. One ignored overreach becomes policy, then policy becomes culture, and eventually people forget they were ever allowed to say no in the first place. According to standard procedure, organizations like HOAs are supposed to exist to maintain shared property values and resolve basic community issues, not operate like miniature governments inventing authority they legally don't possess. But from a legal perspective, the line between enforcement and coercion gets crossed real fast once fear becomes the primary management tool. And trust me, Randall knew exactly what he was doing. This is a psychological trap a lot of people fall into. If enough neighbors comply publicly, everyone else starts feeling social pressure to obey too, even when the demand itself is questionable. Nobody wants to be the difficult guy. Nobody wants tension at the mailbox or awkward silence during neighborhood cookouts. So people surrender little pieces of control just to keep the peace. The lesson here is, peace built on intimidation never actually lasts. Eventually somebody pushes too far, pressures the wrong person, or gets arrogant enough to stop hiding what they're really after. And when that happens, paperwork suddenly matters a whole lot more than personality. Honestly, I don't even hate Randall anymore. Guys like him exist everywhere. Corporate offices, city councils, school boards, HOAs. People who mistake authority for ownership and assume confidence can replace legality. What matters is recognizing the pattern before it gets normalized. Because once you start believing you need permission to exercise rights you already legally possess, you're halfway trapped already. So yeah, maybe this story was about water on the surface, but I think deeper down it was really about something else. Boundaries, pride, independence, the quiet difference between cooperation and control. And I'll say this too, if you ever find yourself dealing with an HOA, landlord, board member, or anybody throwing around rules that suddenly feel excessive, slow the conversation down and start asking for documentation. Calmly, patiently. Because people operating within real authority usually have no problem showing you the paperwork. The ones bluffing, they tend to get angry instead. Anyway, that's my story. And honestly, I'm curious now, Have any of you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare like this, or seen somebody in power push way beyond what they were legally allowed to do? Drop your stories in the comments, because after everything that happened in Pine Hollow, I've got a feeling this kind of thing is way more common than people realize.